This is Oral Rehab Lecture 6. In Lecture 6, I'm continuing the discussion of consequences of hearing loss. And in this particular lecture, I'm going to be talking about the problems that the hearing loss imposes on an individual in their day-to-day life. So thinking more now about some of the specific circumstances of difficulty that a hearing loss might impose on an individual. Part of the intent of Lecture 6 is to also introduce terminology to you that really represents contemporary terminology of disability. So the first part one here will kind of go through some of the of these sort of contemporary terms, and then we'll kind of use them, sort of sprinkle them throughout the course. But it's a basic way to describe circumstantial or situational kinds of problems. Now, the word that I've already used a little bit with you was the word impairment. And we used impairment in the context of hearing loss, hearing impairment, to be synonymous with loss of auditory sensitivity. I mentioned to you, I'm sure, if not, I'll mention it here, that to some ears, and really I'm talking metaphorically here, to some people, rather, I suppose, the use of the word impairment is a very threatening kind of word. Even Ross, one of the great heroes of oral rehabilitation, in this stigma article that you saw recently, objects to this the word and to the use of the word impairment, because particularly from a sort of a pediatric point of view, to say to a parent, your child is impaired, has a hearing impairment, that's kind of a threatening kind of way to say it. Remember, in oral rehab, we want to talk from the point of view of residual hearing, so it's much better and more positive and a much better first step with parents to describe where your child begins to hear, and these are the range of sounds from here to here that your child would be able to hear. And not to say your child is impaired, seems to be getting off on a bad foot, and I sort of agree. Nonetheless, the word impairment is still a term that's used, and rather uniformly, by most sort of agencies and organizations. So as you see on the slide, sort of the major hearing-related organizations, so American Speech and Hearing Association, American Academy of Otolaryngology, head and neck surgeons, these are ENT doctors, American Academy of Audiology, as well as the World Health Organization, the WHO, all use this term impairment relatively similarly. And impairment to all of these agencies is a problem in body structure or function yielding a change in the worse outside the range of normal. So it does have the qualifier that there is a range of normal, and these results that we're talking about are outside the range of normal. So you could say abnormal, but that's almost just as bad. But rather we say that that's impaired. So that's impairment. When we think about what an audiogram is, and particularly since we can define what within normal limits range is, typically anything from 0 decibels to 25 decibels hearing level on the audiogram as being normal, within normal limits, then any test on an audiogram that is poorer than that would then be impairment or hearing loss. And so therefore the data on an audiogram are really said to be impairment data. Persons with hearing loss, technically, therefore, are outside the range of normal. They deviate from the norm, and therefore they are technically abnormal. We would say that they do have an impairment, technically abnormal, just simply because they're outside the range of normal. This particular deviation from normal limits, again, as we've already said, could have medical consequences and non-medical consequences. The non-medical consequences could affect that person's self-image. It could affect their role in society, which is to say the sorts of things that a person can do. And it's going to affect the person's quality of life. We've already sort of talked about that, and talked about their quality of life and their families, their spouses, their significant others. So most of what we're going to kind of continue on in this discussion in Lecture 6 is going to be a discussion of of basically these sorts of problems and circumstances that affect individuals. Now, when we consider the effects of an impairment on a person's life, on an individual's life, we can say that we're talking about what are the disadvantages imposed by that impairment on a person's efficiency in executing their activities of daily life. The terminology here has changed, and it changed somewhere around the year 2001. What I'm showing you here is ICF stands for International Classification of Functioning. Now, I put on your Moodle website a link and a couple of documents to the what still is the ICF. Even though the dates for the ICF and the what I call the ICF checklist are from 2002, 2003, they remain contemporary documents. I checked on them before I uploaded them to the Moodle site, and they're still the same documents that have been there since 2002, 2003. And so this is an approach to the description of health primarily, and to health disparities, to health differences, and that's what ICF is. Again, International Classification of Functioning. The converse of that would be International Classification of Diseases. They do that one too, but now we're talking about functioning, not circumstances of pathology. In ICF, again, ICF is, again, World Health Organization. So what this means is that whatever it says here, 191 countries that are part of the World Health Organization sort of participated in whatever the conference was that defined and described the ICF, and so it's there for all member nations to utilize. So in ICF terms, when someone is living a healthy life, they engage in two basic kinds of activities. They engage in activities, which are specifically tasks or actions that the person can do, and they engage in participation. They do things in life situations. Again, this isn't stuff I made up, so don't shoot the messenger on this one. Just simply relating to the language that was adopted by, again, the World Health Organization. But it's important to note that, again, what do we do in a healthy life? We engage in activities, and we participate in life situations and life circumstances. Now, I'll give you a couple examples here in a second to kind of maybe elaborate on that just a little bit. So, again, when there's an impairment, the impairment, again, as I said, refers to the impairment causes disadvantages in how a person is able to do their activities and their efficiency of daily life. So one very specific word or phrase really that's very specific here to our contemporary terminology is this word of this phrase of activity limitations. So we talked about activities. Now the impairment imposes an activity limitation, meaning now the individual is going to have difficulty in executing specific activities. Again, we'll give you some examples from the ICF checklist shortly. But an activity is going to be essentially a primary consequence. Now, by primary here, we're talking about is something that the primary consequence would be how communication is affected, how the ability to understand speech is affected. That is an activity limitation. Your activity of understanding speech when you have a hearing impairment is going to be compromised. There's going to be some other things too. Generally said, at least in America, this general notion of that you are unable to do specific things was generally known as disability. Now the terminology has changed a little bit from pre-2002. The other phrase that's important in the ICF terminology, again talking about how does the impairment affect a person's efficiency in daily life, is this other notion of participation, but sort of the negative aspect of participation is called participation restrictions. And again, this is now problems that an individual has in involvement in life situations. In a way, you could think of this as how does almost like as a secondary effect, although that would sort of seem to put them in order, and that's really not fair, and that's not the intent of the ICF. But what we're seeming to say here is these are the consequences of the impairment that affect the person's ability to engage in specific life activities. That might be educational, might be vocational, it may be hobbies, it may be going to social events, to religious events, the sorts of things that a person would do, the sorts of activities that you would do in life. Pre-2002, this was known as handicap. So a person was handicapped when they couldn't do all these things. In contemporary terminology, handicap is not really a word that's used very much at all in disability discussions. ICF would prefer we say the person has participation restrictions. So I went the wrong way. Sorry. Here we go. So when an individual has activity limitations and participation restrictions, it would be interesting to know, well, how do we know what's one versus what's the other? Now, ICF doesn't really break this down for us, at least not regarding hearing impairment. So we're going to have to figure that out a little bit. And I'll show you just as one example here from the ICF. From the ICF, this is actually from the ICF, what I called ICF 2002 on your the handout was called the ICF checklist, which is a shorter document than the other one that you would find at the ICF website. They just kind of lumped this all together, activities and participation. Now, as we'll see in part 2 of this screencast, activities for here that are pertinent to us would be communication, perhaps learning, applying knowledge. But participation restriction really would be engagement in community, social, and civic life. So as I would understand it, communication, hearing impairment would cause an activity limitation that would be pertinent to communication, and then participation restrictions would be caused by the impairment affecting the ability to the individual's ability to engage in their community, social, and civic life. With that, we'll adjourn to part 2, and we'll sort of start with that with some glimpses at the ICF checklist. So if you don't have that, go ahead and get that now.